Good evening, everyone. It is Friday, June the 26th, 2020. It is currently 10:36 p.m. Central Time, and I am coming to you live from Victory Baptist Church, located here in the middle of nowhere, Texas, for kind of a late night, weird, bizarre discussion that is going to be somewhat disturbing, but sometimes we have to open that door that says, stay out, warning, do not enter. Sometimes we have to open that door and see what's behind it, because even though it may be disturbing, even though it may sound crazy, even though maybe no one else wants to look behind that door, sometimes we have to open the door. And I'm using that illustration because I'm sitting here, obviously, I'm in the church. The building is empty. It's late Friday night, and literally right behind me is a door. And if I open that door right now, all the lights in the back part of the church is dark. It's completely dark back there. So if I was to open the door and walk back there, I'm in an empty building. It's 10:30 something at night. It probably would kind of a weird, creepy feeling walking back there, and it's just dark, right? If you've ever, I remember all the years that I worked in the medical world, and a couple of years, my job was to work late at night, and I was kind of responsible for a little bit of everything. I was responsible for security. I was responsible for admissions to the hospital. I was responsible for taking bodies down to the morgue, which was always like the morgue was in the basement. And if someone passed away or died in the emergency room, then I would have to go and take the body down, take them off the gurney, place them, and yes, right. It was and it's like there was no one down there, and it's just there you are with this body. Yeah. So sometimes we have to face those things that are uncomfortable. We're in a situation where we don't like it. And tonight we got to talk about some kind of pretty crazy things that may sound, at one point, maybe it was just a thing of science fiction. Maybe it was at a time it was a thing talked about on late night radio programs that were kind of known for their conspiratorial thinking, and that they were crazy people. Like the crazy people stayed up late at night to listen to those radio programs, right? I was one of them. And sometimes things they talked about at one point, maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, that everybody thought they were crazy. Well, that craziness starts becoming a reality, and, we need to talk about it because they raise lots of ethical, philosophical, and theological questions. And I think most of the world is distracted by so many other things that are going on, that these things are happening, and no one is stopping to go, wait a minute, where are we headed? And we need to know where we're headed. And so we're really going to dig in and talk about this. Now, if you've been listening to me for over the last, a month or two, you'll notice kind of a theme, all right? Let me see here. I'm looking at my podcast. If you go back to June the 14th, 2020, June the 14th, 2020, I did a podcast that I entitled Coming Genetic Apocalypse. Coming Genetic Apocalypse. Now, in that episode, I played the audio from a Christian program where they were talking about things happening in the science world, dealing with, human DNA, editing, editing the genetic code within human beings to try to make them better, to try to take away all the pain and suffering and difficulty, and to make us stronger and faster and smarter and stronger, and all the different things that it promised. It promises this, like this, a brave new world, but at what cost? Where is it taking us? And it was a Christian radio program. And some people may have said, well, that's just crazy talk. Crazy religious people are out of their minds. But what they were discussing, there's been lots of other discussion about those exact same things, not on Christian radio stations, but on, NPR, for example. And I'll be playing an audio clip from a public radio station talking about some of these things. But that coming genetic apocalypse, raised a lot of ethical questions. And here's the question from a theological perspective. How much can you alter the human the human DNA, the human genetic makeup, how much can you alter it? How much can you edit it till you end up with something that is less than human? Less than truly a human being. If you take embryos and you edit the genetic makeup and you edit the DNA and you edit and edit and edit to try to make it better and try to make it better, what do you ultimately end up with? You end up with something less than human. And how far, what happens? What happens if you have an entire, if cloning people? Like if you clone people and you do all of these different experiments, where do you end up? And it raises ethical questions, moral questions, and it definitely answers theological questions. How much can you edit before the person is a human being? And if they're not a human being, then they don't have a soul. Then they don't go to heaven or hell. Like, it raises lots of important questions. And how far can we alter that? And what are the ramifications? Again, it sounds like something crazy. It sounds something like out of a science fiction movie. It sounds like something creepy behind the door or down in the basement at the morgue. And it's creepy. We don't want to go there, but we need to talk about these very important things. So on that date, yes, that was, make sure I'm looking at this. Yeah, June the 14th, 2020, Coming Genetic Apocalypse. And we may do a part 2 to Coming Genetic Apocalypse because the Christian radio program did a part 2, so we may listen to that. Then on June the 17th, I did one called Editing Human Embryos. Editing Human Embryos. Now, if you have an embryo, how far can you edit? How much editing do you want done? Now, again, the promise is we can edit the human embryo, and then that child will not have all of these medical problems, can avoid all of these diseases, can avoid all of these problems, can grow up healthy, and basically we create designer babies that are perfect. We can avoid, human suffering, human, diseases and birth defects and all these. We can be born where we won't lose our hair and we would be tall and we have good bone structure and all of these wonderful things. Do we want a world of designer human beings that remove all the imperfections that we all hate and that we all want to remove? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? How do we view that from a theological standpoint? These are important questions. So those are 2 that I have dealt with, and you should go back and listen to that. I want to advance that discussion tonight. So what we're going to do, I don't know which order I want to do this. I've got an article that I want to read, but I want to at least start. It's an hour long, and there's no way we can analyze an hour-long clip at this. So we're gonna play some of this. This may turn into part 2. We may have to do part 2, part 3, part 4. There's so many issues to talk about, but we're going to at least let this play for a little while. And here's the reason why: because it comes from a public radio station, right? I found it on NPR. I found it on the NPR website, and this goes back to January of 2020. So this year, January 2020. Public radio, not some crazy conspiratorial radio station, not a Christian radio station where you can go, man, those religious people are just crazy and they're paranoid and they think that, these evil, ungodly scientists are trying to create these less than human beings and they believe that this is going to bring in the end of time. No, we're talking NPR dealing with these issues. Let's see at least what they had to say. And then we'll throw in some additional information. All right, so here we go. Let's listen to this. Are you ready? Here we go.
From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm Meghna Chakrabarty, and this is On Point. We're going to be spending the hour today with Professor Jennifer Doudna. She's one of the world's most brilliant molecular biologists, and she joins us from her home campus of the University of California, Berkeley today. Professor Doudna, welcome to you.
Hi, Meghna. Great to be here.
So, first of all, I'm wondering if we could start with a story. I read that around Thanksgiving of 2018, you received an email from a scientist in China, and that email had a very terse subject line, which was just 2 words. It was babies born. What was that email? What was your reaction to it?
Right. Well, that was a pretty surprising email to get, as you can probably imagine. It was an email that it was quite short, and it basically explained that Dr. He Jiankui had created CRISPR-edited babies in China, and that meant making changes to the DNA of these children that would become part of their genome and be inheritable by future generations, something that had not, to anyone's knowledge, been done before that, and certainly was a shocking thing to find out about at the moment when we were just getting ready to launch a meeting in Hong Kong about human genome editing, where the very topic was going to be the use of genome editing in humans, including in embryos or babies.
Yeah. So, okay. And in that conference, he gave a presentation, right, about those CRISPR-edited embryos. And you've said in interviews past that you felt the hairs on the back of your neck standing up?
It was pretty.
All right, I got to jump in right here. CRISPR. If you don't know what CRISPR is, because CRISPR edited babies, all right? What is CRISPR? CRISPR technology is a simple yet powerful tool for editing genomes. It allows researchers to easily alter DNA sequences and modify gene function. Its many potential applications, including correcting genetic defects, treating and preventing the spread of disease, and improving crops. However, its promise also raises ethical concerns. All right. So there it is. It's a simple yet powerful tool for editing genomes. It allows researchers to easily alter DNA sequences and modify gene function. And again, it's always the promise of what it can do. And the promise is, and this is very important from a theological perspective, the promise is to try to alleviate suffering. Try to remove suffering, try to remove problems, try to remove those things we want. And we all, in one sense, want that. But from a theological perspective, how much suffering do we try to remove and try to avoid before we slide over into a theological issue? Is there some suffering? Now, this is going to be a difficult question to answer. Is there some suffering that is a part of God's plan? And is it wrong to remove it? Well, we take things to remove a headache. Is that wrong? We take things to backache, to remove a backache. We go to surgeries. We do things to improve our bodies. We do things. So we do all kinds of things to improve the quality of our life and to remove suffering and to try to cure and heal medical problems, disease, and sickness. Is that ethically wrong? Well, if that isn't wrong, how far can you go? How can we be theologically consistent? Is it, do we say, well, once we start altering human DNA and human genetic makeup at a genetic level, are we now entering into the area of playing God? Very important question. But yeah, I want you to realize the average person hears about this and they don't seem to care. The scientists, the scientific world, the hair stands up on the back of their neck and they're like, whoa, we're entering into a brave new world. I just wish we could wake up everyone else to go, I think we're entering into a brave new world. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But let's continue. Remember, this was January 2020. All right, let's continue.
Pretty wild. This scientist was on the schedule for this meeting, although none of us knew he was going to be presenting the kind of data that he showed. And it was really quite, I don't know what the word is, shocking would be one, astounding would be another, to see the actual data presented for making targeted changes to a gene in human embryos that was done for the stated purpose of protecting those embryos and the children that they grew into from future infection by the HIV virus. The problem was that, well, there were many problems, but, both the scientifically and technically as well as ethically and societally, sort of everything was wrong with what he presented.
everything was wrong. Okay, so folks, here's why this matters. Because for those of you who don't know who Professor Doudna is, she is one of the inventors of the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology. She published one of the first papers about it back in 2012. And CRISPR has been called one of the most important scientific discoveries in the past 100 years, at the very least. I mean, people are saying that it could transform everything about basic scientific research, about drug development, about agriculture, synthetic biology. I mean, Professor Doudna, I don't think is it hyperbole to say that people are talking about CRISPR technology as if it could really sort of change the world?
Well, it's the kind of thing that, it's sort of something that before you see the science behind it, it sounds like science fiction because it really involves changing the code of life and being able to do that in a targeted fashion that allows scientists to make precise changes to individual genes or whole sets of genes that control the phenotype and the whole look and behavior of organisms, and that's true across biology. So it's really a cross-cutting technology, and furthermore, it's widely available. It's not so technically difficult or expensive to do that it's only available to the few. And so it just really has transformed biological research as well as we think the future applications of genome editing in the future based on its potential.
Yeah, I mean, so to put it mildly, you have helped usher into the world an elegant, low-cost way of editing the genes of anything that has DNA in it. I mean, it's the power to tinker with the very building blocks of life made more easy than it has ever been before.
And amazingly, it all started with bacteria.
Right.
The power to tinker with the building blocks of life. The power to tinker with the building blocks of life. Try to wrap your mind around that. That is where we are. Remember, this was January of 2020. Let's continue.
I love about it. It has a very humble origin.
The little circular DNA of a little bacteria. I mean, tell us about that.
Well, bacteria have been dealing with viruses for a very long time, and they've been around for a lot longer than humans and probably most other life on our planet. So they've been having to engage in battle with infectious agents for probably ever since their origin. So it's fascinating to find out how they do that. How do they fight back against viruses? That was the question that my lab and a handful of others had back when we started investigating these CRISPR immune systems. And it turns out that the way these systems work is that they are able to program proteins, one of which is called Cas9, to find and destroy viral DNA. And by understanding that fundamental process, it was possible to harness that as a technology for something very different, namely genome editing, because of the fundamental biochemical activities of these programmable proteins like Cas9.
So, listeners, I promise you, or warn you / promise you, we're actually going to get more into the science of CRISPR with Professor Doudna a little later in the show. But Professor, one of the reasons why many reasons why we wanted to talk to you is that it's only been a couple of years. It's been a relatively small time in the lifetime of a transformative new discovery since that 2012 paper that you wrote, and yet that email about those CRISPR edited embryos with that subject line of "babies born," you very soon after you and your team understood what the potential of CRISPR would be, started worrying that it could usher in a new era of science or use of this technology that had a dark side to it. Did you not?
Right, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that as soon as it was clear that this technology was working widely in different types of biological systems, different kinds of cells, it was really obvious that there would be temptations to tinker with DNA in ways that could be really profound, namely altering the code of life in human embryos that would give rise to heritable changes. So there were a handful of us in those early days that were starting to think about how we would possibly be able to, first of all, communicate about that and do so in a clear way to people that were not scientific experts in the field, and also to raise awareness and figure out how we would move ahead with some kind of global regulation or some kind of restriction on using it in ways that could be very dangerous to humans and certainly have real ethical and societal issues as well.
So lay it out for me as simply as you can. You're one of the people who helped invent this technology. What's at stake? What's at stake for all of us if we don't have some sort of common global agreement over the best uses of CRISPR?
Now, let me stop here. She's acknowledging there could be a dark side of this, but let's just start from the fundamental premise. The fundamental premise is the technology gives them the ability to tinker. Remember her words. And if for some reason when I tried to say this a few minutes ago, if the mic wasn't on, I apologize. So let me say it again. She stated that this technology gives them the ability to tinker with the very building blocks of life. Now, she doesn't perceive that necessarily to be the dark side, but then someone could take the ability to tinker with the very building blocks of life and then slide over to doing something, quote unquote, on the dark side. It starts off, is it not possibly even ethically questionable to be tinkering with the building blocks of life? But again, the way it's always sold is we're going to tinker with the building blocks of life to create a better world where there's no more pain, no more suffering. Oh, wait. That sounds like a promise of heaven. Can human beings create a utopian vision, a utopian existence on this life where there is no pain, no more suffering, and all of those diseases are gone? It would be wonderful if that can happen, but what are the theological ramifications to that, the ethical questions, and how far do you have to go? How bad can this get? What could actually happen? All right. Now, before I go back to her, let me just show you how bad things can get. Let me just show you. This is crazy. All right. And you can read this on the theologycentral.net. Go to theologycentral.net, go to the blog section, look for my entry on from I don't know what the date is for this entry. For some reason, it's saying June the 30th, which would be impossible unless I went into the future and did this. Okay. But here is, if you go to the blog section, you should be able to find it. Theology Central. Go to theologycentral.net, go to the blog section, and you're going to see this headline. Are you ready? Horror show. Watchdog reveals FDA paid for fresh human fetal parts for humanized mice experiments. Now that sounds like, you talk about the dark side. Now this is going crazy, crazy, crazy. Now I'm not saying her technology has ultimately led to this, but I'm just showing you that there's a dark side to all of this kind of messing with the human genome, editing DNA, all the different things. There's a whole world of direction that this could go that the average person is not even aware of. Let me read this to you again. Horror show. Watchdog reveals FDA paid for fresh human fetal parts for humanized mice experiments. Here's the story. And what sounds like something from the mind of writer Mary Shelley, who authored the novel Frankenstein, a federal government agency paid for human fetal body parts to be used in the creation of humanized mice. Oh, yeah. Crazy. Let me read this to you again. What sounds like something from the mind of writer Mary Shelley, who authored the novel Frankenstein, a federal government agency paid for human fetal body parts to be used in the creation of humanized mice. Judicial Watch, a nonprofit government watchdog group, announced Tuesday it received 165 pages of records from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, showing the agency between 2012 and 2018 signed 8 contracts worth more than $96,000 with Advanced Bioscience Resources to acquire fresh and never frozen tissue from first and second trimester aborted fetuses for use in creating humanized mice for ongoing research. These documents are a horror show, said Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton. These records showed that the FDA was trafficking in human fetal parts. All right. The Advanced Bioscience Resources, ABR, is a nonprofit firm that has been the subject of criminal referrals from House and Senate committees investigating whether Planned Parenthood or any other entity was illegally profiting from the handling of fetal tissue from aborted babies. Federal law regulates the purchases and acceptance of human fetal tissue for research purposes. It is unlawful to knowingly transfer fetal tissue to for profit. Judicial Watch filed a federal lawsuit in May of 2019 after the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services failed to respond adequately to the Freedom of Information Act request. All right. So they've got all the information here, and you can look at the actual documents, but I just want you to hear that again. This is just crazy. It's somewhat frightening, but let me just read this to you again. So they acquired fresh and never frozen tissue from first and second trimester aborted fetuses to use in creating humanized mice for ongoing research. Now, you don't think there's a dark side to this? I mean, that's crazy. That's getting almost no attention, basically no mainstream attention. The media is not even talking about that. They're going to talk about everything else. That's the kind of stuff that, like, the people talking about it are considered the crazy people. You need someone going, look, we've got to figure out where we're going with this. We've got to figure out what we're doing. So let's listen to a little bit more of what she has to say here.
Well, I think what's at stake in the short term, at least in my view, is that we have to ensure that the public perception of this technology is realistic, and that means not being too afraid of something that has the potential to do real good, but also being realistic about what the risks are. And that's, it's always a tricky balance to get right. And, I think that's where we are today in the field of gene editing and with CRISPR in particular is, trying to strike that balance. I feel that ensuring, public perception of the technology that's accurate is important, partly because, as you probably know, we're already seeing CRISPR moving into the clinic for treating disease. We're seeing some really exciting announcements coming out about that. And that, that will really shape in many ways how the technology continues to unfold. And so it's very important that people understand how, at least a little bit about how this works. These announcements that are coming out are absolutely not about editing babies, right? Mm-hmm. They're about, making changes in the DNA of cells that could help fight cancer or other diseases in the future. And those affect only individuals. They're not making heritable changes. So, these are some important, they're sort of details, but they're actually not, right? They're really important distinctions in the way the same technology is being used in very different ways.
But it wasn't that long ago that you said perhaps there needs to be a moratorium on a particular form of gene editing, that germline or heritable type gene editing. But since then, you've said that even a moratorium may not be enough.
Right. Well, back in 2015, we had a meeting out here in California with a handful of people, including 2 of the scientists who had been involved in the 1970s discussion around an earlier technology called molecular cloning that was also, had the potential to be dangerous, and people didn't understand in those early days of molecular cloning how it might be deployed. And so there was a quite, at least in the scientific community, quite famous meeting called the Asilomar meeting in 1975 that David Baltimore and Paul Berg, both of whom are Nobel laureates, very distinguished scientists who had been engaged in that discussion. We had both of them at this 2015 meeting, along with a number of other folks who were using CRISPR in different ways to discuss how we would think about moving ahead and, trying to educate the public about CRISPR technology and how one might imagine regulating its use in humans in particular. And that led to a publication in the spring of 2015 that called for a moratorium effectively. We didn't use that word, but really was basically raising the alarm for scientists that were beginning to deploy the CRISPR technology, that we should really guard against any rush into human embryos for many reasons that were discussed in that piece. And then since then, as you pointed out, the field has continued to advance very rapidly. There were multiple publications from different labs that began testing the CRISPR technology in human embryos, not for the purpose of creating a pregnancy, but to see how it would work in that setting. And those experiments started to show that, that could be done. And so it really did raise the potential to move ahead in the clinic, which, led me to say we can't just ask for a moratorium. We actually have to do more than that.
Well, Professor Jennifer Doudna, stand by for a second. We'll be right back. This is On Point.
All right. Now, I'm going to stop there because it's after 11 p.m. And thanks for somebody was listening to us for the previous live broadcast tonight. So thank you very much for that encouraging email. Yes, I did have a rough day. So, but hopefully things are going better right now. Hopefully things are going better. So there's a lot she's talking about there, and we definitely want to come back to this at some point. But I just want you to, even the people involved in the technology, even the people at the very fundamental level of creating the technology, they're worried about where this is going and they're concerned. Let me make this this is very important to understand. There was discussion, and we could probably do a Google search right now. If you look for CRISPR and COVID-19, there's discussion of CRISPR technology being utilized to, guess what? Find a way to help with COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic, remember, this was January 2020. Nobody was talking about COVID-19 in January 2020. Very few people were. I think me and my friend from Nebraska were talking about COVID-19 in January of 2020. But most of the world could care less and didn't think it was going to be a big deal. And here we are. But when you have a global pandemic, which obviously by definition is global, you have this going around and you have all this concern, cases, people dying. People are willing to accept a lot of, hey, use gene editing. Let's do so. Again, now, that may not be embryonic gene editing, but you're still possibly going to do editing of genes in order to try to prevent this. Now, people are going to be much more willing to accept something that may sound bizarre in the middle of this pandemic. So I think this pandemic may give rise to people trying different things and getting more and more of the public's approval. She talked a lot about public perception. Well, the perception, I think, is guided by them constantly selling it as, look at all the wonderful things. But we didn't allow her to finish. But what we're going to do, we'll finish by playing a clip that aired on a Christian podcast just a few days ago. So this is really, it's showing up all over the place. And I really think people need to pay attention. But let's listen to what they have to say, because I think they're too positive, and I'm going to come back and offer why I think the future is much darker than they seem to think that maybe it won't be as bad as some people think. But let's listen to what they have to say, and then maybe we'll have to come back and do a part two or a part, a different podcast where we play maybe the rest of that. There's just so much to talk about here. It's hard to know exactly which direction to go, but let's just jump in and see where we can go. All right. So here we go. Let's listen to this. I think this is important.
Yet another set of scientists can't resist playing God with the human genome. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint.
Now, remember, the other program we were listening to was from January 2020. This is from June of 2020, just about 2 or 3 days ago. All right. So from January, we hear that discussion. Now here we are in June, and they're like, hey, and here we are. We have some more scientists, and they cannot resist basically playing God when it comes to human genome and the human genetic makeup. Like, so what happened, and what are they discussing? Let's see.
For years, I've worried and warned about the dangers posed by gene editing technologies such as CRISPR. In the words of one of its inventors, CRISPR makes the human genome, quote, as malleable as a piece of literary prose at the mercy of an editor's red pen. Well, at least that's the promise that has yet to materialize. In 2018, a Chinese scientist announced he'd use CRISPR to genetically modify human embryos. At the time, more respectable scientists denounced his actions as unethical, given how new the technology was and just how little ethical oversight there was for using it. In essence, this dangerous technology had been released into the world with no limitations except to, quote, play nice. But nearly all of the criticism directed at Dr. He had to do with secondary issues, such as informed consent. Relatively little was said about the possibility of gene edits producing mutations that might produce cancer or other illnesses, and essentially nothing was said about the ethical nature of the technology itself, whether or not editing genes is something we should do at all. Now, why was this ethical outrage so shallow? 2 reasons, I suppose. First, science advances today on a philosophical mandate that's barely contained by an ethical utilitarianism. That's just a big worded way of saying that our worship of science comes with an idea that if we can do it, we should do it. And the only thing that limits that is if someone might get hurt. Case in point, The Guardian called CRISPR not a bad idea or a dangerous technology, but, quote, an imperfect tool. Why? Well, because it could lead to off-target edits. That squishy bit of ethical reasoning leads to the second reason I thought that the outrage directed at the Chinese scientists was, as I put it at the time, faux. I believe that other scientists, including those who decried Dr. He as being rogue, were doing the same thing, just more discreetly. In other words, I did not believe that the loud denunciation and even imprisonment of one Chinese scientist would stop others who were just as intent on playing God. And it turns out it didn't. Apparently, a team of researchers at the Francis Crick Institute in London have used CRISPR to edit 18 donated human embryos. Their purpose, they claim, was to study the role of a particular gene in the earliest stages of human development. Well, unfortunately, about half of the embryos contained major unintended edits. Major unintended edits is just a euphemism for mutation and genetic damage, which, as Medium told its readers, could lead to birth defects or medical problems like cancers late in life. As one genetics researcher put it, you're affecting so much of the DNA around the gene you're trying to edit that you could be inadvertently affecting other genes and causing problems. But even worse, the Frick Institute team didn't inadvertently mess with a gene near the ones that they were targeting. In fact, they hit their targets. The results, however, were unexpected. Fyodor Ernov, a professor of molecular and cell biology at Berkeley, put it this way: "There's no sugarcoating this," he said. "This should be a restraining order for all genome editors to stay the living daylights away from embryo editing." Well, once a gene editing expert gets frightened, you'd think we might want to cool our jets a little in this whole playing God thing, but I doubt it. Scientists ignore restraining orders that lack legal punch. What happened in China didn't deter researchers in London, and what happened in London won't deter anyone either. By the way, all the embryos affected by the Francis Crick Institute team were destroyed. When science operates independently of religion, philosophy, law, or public policy, then researchers, to paraphrase a line from Jurassic Park, become so preoccupied with whether or not they can do something, they never stop and think if they should do something. So the only way forward is that we, working through our elected leaders, will tell scientists no. They're going to whine and moan, as they did when President Bush curtailed embryonic stem cell research. But so what? As it turns out, we didn't need to kill embryos for their stem cells. Likewise, we don't need to play God with the human genome or with unborn children either. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.
All right. Now, he thinks we can work through our elected officials and we can somehow stop or pause all of this. I'm going to argue we can't. I'm going to argue it's over, that we're done and everything's going to move forward at a rapid pace and it's going to speed up. And I'm going to offer the following reasons. Number one, distraction. I think the world is so distracted by so many different issues that a lot of these things are not even being covered. They're not even being talked about in mainstream news. A good portion of the world don't even believe anything mainstream news even has to say anyway. Journalism is almost basically dead. Everyone perceives journalists as being biased and have their own agenda, which there's a lot of truth to that, and journalists have done that to themselves. So I just think there's distraction. There's distraction and well, we'll just say distraction. I could kind of slide into a lack of trust, but we'll just go with distraction. The world is distracted by so many things that this is not getting the coverage. Even if it was getting the coverage, I don't know if people would even pay much attention to it. I think that the world is distracted, and during a time of great distraction, then people, if they're not in the light, they're in the dark, and if they're in the dark, they can be doing a lot of questionable things and moving forward, even if there's some attempt to try to stop it. I don't think you're going to get a universal agreement to stop certain things. You're going to have rogue scientists and rogue nations doing crazy things, and we're going to move forward. That's number one. Number two, the constant taking human embryos, right? Taking human embryos and doing crazy things with them and then destroying them, that is going to continue because we have a fundamental belief in a large portion of the scientific world, medical world, and a large portion of the world at large that, hey, there is no life until the baby is born. So you can create quote unquote life, create it, put it together, have an embryo. You can do all these kinds of things. As long as the baby is not born, you can edit, you can mess with it because it's a potential life. It's not an actual life. That fundamental philosophy, that fundamental belief, that almost religious belief that there is no life until after birth. And even there's, some who even want to take it further. But I mean, that's a very common belief. Hey, that baby, that's not actually a baby yet. That's not actually a baby yet. That's just a fetus. And you can do whatever you want to the embryo. You can do whatever you want to the fetus. That, I think it's going to allow for crazy, crazy experiments to happen because of that very fundamental belief that is so prevalent in society today. So we have people who are distracted. They're not paying any attention to all of this crazy stuff. Secondly, look, if the fetus is not a life, right? It's just a potential life. Then why can't you go in and edit, mess with it, do whatever you want? Create the fetus. Bring the sperm, the egg together. Fertilize it. Do everything. Basically, create life in a lab. Hey, but until it's born, it's not a life. And then edit it all day long and play God with it. That's going to allow that until society stops and says no. Life begins at conception. And once this happens, then we have life, and we have to protect that life. We have to pass laws to protect that life, and that you can't do these things to it until that happens. Until there's a fundamental change in when we believe when life starts, and then passing laws to protect that life. Then that life is going to be utilized for crazy experiments. And that's what we're going to get. We're going to get more and more and more of that. So, number one, we have a distracted world. Number two, we have a belief that life doesn't begin until birth. And so anything before that, it's not really alive. So then that takes away the ethical dilemma. Do whatever you want with it. Do all the experiments you want to it. It's not really alive. And if you can convince yourself it's not really alive, then you can do whatever you want to it. And that's one of the fundamental problems. And number three, very important, we have a moral relativism that is run rampant. Where is the moral standard? What makes something right? What makes something wrong? What doing this to this and researching this and creating that. There is no transcendent morality. We basically live in a time where everyone does what is right in their own eyes. So if you take distraction, you take a fundamental belief that life really doesn't begin until birth, and so anything before that you can experiment and do all the editing and all the crazy things you want. And number three, moral relativism. then you can bring in all the elected officials you want. You're not going to stop it. You're not going to stop it. And I think we're going to move forward for it. I don't know where it ends, and I don't know how fast we get there. But we're headed into a very, 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 very strange world. And there's been plenty of people talking about this for a very long time. They were kind of dismissed as wackos and crazy people. Turns out they weren't crazy. Turns out here we are. And we really need to be paying a lot of attention to this. And, I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to it. And we just need to... we need to really think about the theological implications and what could it mean. I mean, I think here's the question, and the Christian radio program, brought this up. In Genesis chapter 6, some people believe that what you have there is you have the daughters of men, human women, and the sons of God were angelic beings of some kind, angelic beings, fallen angelic beings, who came and began to engage in physical relations with the daughters of men. They began, and that this was going to corrupt the human race. It was going to be corrupt the human, that would not be truly human anymore. You get some kind of weird hybrid. Now not everyone interprets Genesis 6 this way. Let's make this very clear. Not everyone interprets it this way. But some believe something horribly went wrong in Genesis chapter 6. Then the whole world is destroyed. And then later on in the Bible, you have about angels being reserved in chains in darkness. Well, what did those angels do? So who are those angels? And some connect them to Genesis 6. Now, the reason a lot of people look at this is because the Bible talks about that in the end, it'll be like in the days of Noah. It'll be like in the days of Noah, and that same kind of situation is going to arise again. That was the Christian radio program that we listened to, a week ago or 2 weeks ago. That was their thesis. Now, I'm not saying I buy into that thesis. Not saying I'm buying into that. I'm saying that it is something we have to consider, and that deals with a lot of how do we interpret Genesis 6. But no matter how you interpret Genesis 6, human beings. There is the technology now to basically edit human beings at the very building blocks of human life, the very building blocks. They can tinker with it. And when you start dealing with the building blocks of human life, how much can you tinker? How much can you edit? Even if you say the benefits are great, before you cross a line ethically, morally, theologically, spiritually. And then we cease to be human. Now, is there something special about being human, or can we alter being human for the betterment of society by eliminating pain and suffering? Now, I will say there's something special about being human because we're created in the image of God. And there's a sanctity to human life. There's a sacredness to human life. But we live in a society that no longer believes the human being is sacred. There's no sanctity. They do not believe we're created in the image of God. So why wouldn't you want to alter it? This is a very important, while we're arguing about should we wear a mask or not wear a mask, and while people want to argue that, there's more important things to argue right now than mask because of COVID-19. The actual editing of human DNA. That's something we need to think about. Now, I'll stop right there. Trust me, I don't want to, but it's almost 11:30, and I'm gonna head home. All right, everyone, have a great night. Email me at newsif@yahoo.com, 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 newsif@yahoo.com. If you want me to go to deal more in this subject, dive more into this subject, let me know. I'll definitely try to do that. My goal is to be back out here tomorrow and to try to, produce some things that I think will be very beneficial and helpful to everyone. So we will see. We'll see how tomorrow goes. All right. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And may God bless you. And please pray for the world that we're currently living in because, man, things are changing and they're changing rapidly. God bless.